Hello, Mate to Thrive Nation. I've been waiting many months for this professor. He's a professor of exercise physiology, nutrition, aging, and most importantly, he's a specialist on creatine and the use of it. And I'm so excited because, as you know, cognitive performance within a corporate perspective, business leaders and executives has been something that we've been focusing on, Mate to Thrive. And so the audience out there, listen up. And the viewers on YouTube, it's going to be a cracker of a show. I just want to give a warm welcome to Professor Darren Candow.
Thank you so much for having me. Really excited to be here and yeah, talk everything about creatine.
Brilliant. So I've been waiting since 2024. So we're going to give you an avatar, an archetype that I think is very, very important. And mainly it's, say, a female executive, corporate executive that's really struggling, just with work, family pressures, trying to exercise, and maybe a male counterpart who's really under pressure. And we're seeing a lot of these people that are struggling with mental performance issues.
Yeah.
We've partnered with Dr. Dale Bredesen and his cognoscopy. We run that with our corporates and business leaders, which has been proven. And that's why I wanted to have you on the show and talk about creatine. So maybe let's just define what creatine is, the different type of sources, and then it's really important part with regards to cognitive performance.
Sure. So creatine is a nitrogen-containing compound. It's very similar to an amino acid most people are familiar with protein, but we naturally actually produce it in two areas of the body, in the liver and the brain. So as we're sitting here, we're actually in the process of producing small amounts. On average, about 1 to 3 grams are being produced. That's likely influenced by your habitual diet. And that bodes to the second part. Creatine can be naturally found in certain food products. It's only an animal-based. So red meat or seafood have a higher concentration there. So anybody watching that's a vegan, vegetarian, emphasizing a plant-based diet, you're not getting hardly any, if any at all, through your diet. So we have creatine in our body. It's in our cells. And the goal there is to help maintain the energy currency molecule of our cell called ATP. And it's not just in our muscle. Our brain is relying on ATP to power its source all throughout the day. And so the safety profile of creatine is exceptional because we're naturally producing it in the body, but most people are familiar with supplementation. And it's really exploded. Right now, there's about 19 studies that have been published on cognition and memory alone. And I'm happy to report that 15 of the 19 report favorable effects. They're not really, really large, as we would expect, but they are there. But the best lines of evidence is something you brought up. What about the person who is super busy? Sleep deprivation, jet lag. I think of an ER doctor working overnight, a night shift individual, students staying up all night studying for exams. The best lines of evidence and the most robust lines come from sleep deprivation or areas of mental fatigue. So what we've concluded in the research community is that when the brain is really stressed, that's when creatine supplementation seems to have the best promise. I think if you're getting adequate sleep, great nutrition, no stressors in your life, and I actually don't know anybody with that, but you likely would not see any benefit from supplementation, likely because the brain is already making a little bit of creatine. It doesn't need the rely on supplementation, but those times of sleep deprivation and so on, that's where creatine supplementation can sort of boost the brain's bioenergetics to sort of overcome that. And anecdotally, I hear daily people say they've taken more creatine than what was traditionally recommended for muscle, and they really seemed an improvement in cognition or memory. And when you look at the studies, they seem to seem a great reliance or a benefit for older adults, which is phenomenal. And then even in younger individuals after a night of sleep deprivation or mental fatiguing challenges, it seems to have an effect there. The mechanisms, we're not exactly sure, but we think it reduces oxidative stress. And if it can increase the amount of creatine in the brain for maintaining energy and reduce oxidative stress or sort of pollution for the brain, maybe the brain can heal quicker and function better. So that's kind of a nutshell of where we think it's going.
Brilliant. Now, so in terms of creatine and mental performance, are they is the study showing 20-30% improvement? And then anecdotally, is it a lot more? Because I think someone's listening and saying, I've got this list of supplements here, I've got all these nootropics, which I want to get into later.
Yeah.
How important is this creatine and what percentage improvement are we seeing?
Yeah. The percent improvement varies. It can be from a few minimal percentages all the way up to 20 or 30. It's very subjective. And I think it really comes down to the individual person's lifestyle. And again, you're not going to get much benefit from a healthy person, but it can be significant. So when we talk about these meta-analysis or narrative reviews, it seemed to improve tasks of memory and cognition, especially after sleep deprivation. But there's been a few studies showing without sleep deprivation, it had benefits there as well. So the nice thing is never a study's been shown where it went the other way. You got worse on memory or cognition. So at the end of the day, your brain is only about, 2.5 kilograms, but it utilizes 20 to 25% of your daily energy. So that's why this molecule, which is a high energy compound, has been shown now repeatedly, and it's emerging and accumulating to have the cognitive effects. And that sort of piggybacks now on the idea of like, okay, if there's potential for memory and cognition, what about concussion, trauma? What about Alzheimer's, dementia down the road? Maybe we'll see really substantial clinical effects here. So I think for the next 20 or 30 years, this is probably the focal point of creatine supplementation. I think we have a good grasp on muscle. We're starting to understand a little bit more benefits on bone, but from the neck up, we're starting to have an awareness, and other great lines of evidence I'm sure we'll talk about come from the state of Utah in the United States. Psychiatrists have clearly showed that when creatine is added to antidepressive medications, it reduces symptoms of depression and anxiety in those diagnosed. So now we're starting to see some really clinical applications where this, let's be honest, this molecule discovered in 1832, it got a little bit of promise in 1992 when Linford Christie won the gold medal. And it was just for basically young males wanting to get bigger, stronger, faster, and move forward in 25 years. And here we are, that we've gone from just muscle to overall total body benefits. And it's the #1 research supplement right now on the planet.
Wow. How many studies, Darren?
There's well over 1,000, if you can believe it, looking at from anything from a in vitro to an animal model to humans. And the big explosion is looking at lifestyle across our aging individuals and humans across the lifespan. There's exceptional research going on in Australia with Stacey Ellery and pregnancy, great research in the United States in children. And then we focus on adolescents and elderly individuals. And so it's worldwide, it's global. There's some really good research going on, and it's really, really nice to see.
Okay, so now, Darren, I've been a functional medicine doc for 18 years, physician for 26, and we like to do assessments. So are there assessments on creatine, like using a QEEG and a change there, or a SPECT scan, or doing an autonomic nervous system like HRV assessment over time? Have there been these studies to show that it's actually moved the assessment numbers, maybe not subjectively from patients or clients, but has it shown promise in that area?
Nothing per se, but what we do need to do is make sure that when creatine is coming into the body, it's getting into the tissues it's used. So we've talked already about the brain, but when some of the labs in the world have an MRS, which is essentially the MRI for the brain, we got to make sure that the creatine is accumulating in the brain tissue, and then does it lead to functional benefits. So we haven't looked at functional MRI. We've usually just used imaging, MRI or CT, to see the effects on imaging tissues. Nothing that I'm familiar with on heart rate variability. I think there is a group in the United States starting to look at more cardiovascular parameters. Nothing on the autonomic or parasympathetic nervous systems to see the effect there. It's more in relation to health or performance, but I'm sure as we move the needle forward, those things will come up. Yeah.
It seems to be a natural progression. If you can affect the central nervous system, you're seeing the increase in volume, but you got to see that it affects the function of it. So maybe that's maybe a study for you in terms of heart rate variability. There's so many studies on heart rate variability. You should be able to, formulate a nice study there in terms of improving, because that would be a big, big change.
A huge one, and the one that comes to mind now is like, nothing's looked at oligodendrocytes for MS in the central nervous system. Satellite cells have been looked at the peripheral for hypertrophy, but nothing from a central nervous system drive. There's only been a few studies in people with MS, and it's not showing any benefits, but the mechanisms weren't really looked at. Very tough to do, obviously, when you're looking at cellular central nervous system metabolism and cellular turnover. But I think the big area now in that line is going. We see some potential in Parkinson's and Huntington's, but not a lot of promise. We need large-scale trials there. But depression and anxiety, these are starting to see a little bit more emphasis there for treatment of depression, which would be a global game changer. I think ever since COVID, the world's substantially changed, and I don't think is ever going to go back. And the food prices, the stressors that we're seeing every day, can this molecule, again, in combination with exercise, ideally be part of a treatment program to allow people to live longer, free of disease, and that's the overall goal.
Brilliant. Now, just tell us specifically about doses on the same archetype with
Yes.
someone trying to improve mental performance, the adrenal burnout, low DHEA,
Yeah.
cortisol ratio, a problem,
Yeah.
cortisol low, HRV
Yeah.
very low. What are the
Yeah.
dosages and frequency of dosages?
Yeah. So this dosage information might be a bit surprising to those who've heard of creatine. So we had a well grasp on the dosage for muscle. We're starting to have an idea on bone, but there's probably been about 20 to 25 studies, excuse me, currently on the brain. They're all in different populations, but the consensus is 20 grams a day for at least 7 days seems to be a very effective and viable dose to accumulate in the brain and lead to some brain benefits. Now, there's other studies that clearly showed, hey, 20 grams wasn't enough. A great study out of Brazil showed that, which was very interesting. There's only been one study that looked at 4 grams a day for up to 6 months by Serge Ostiak in Norway. And he also did measure muscle and brain accumulation. 4 grams was enough, but it took several months to do so. So it really comes down to what's consistent for the person. I think if you're going to take the traditional 4 to 5 grams a day, that'll eventually accumulate into the brain, but you really need to be patient. It could take several months. If you've had head trauma or you're in contact sports, or if you're really, really metabolically stressed mentally, I think a higher dose has been shown to be beneficial. And an interesting study out of Utah, again, showed that 2 versus 4 versus 10 grams in adolescent females with clinical depression, and of course, they were on medication. There was no statistical significance between the 3 treatments for depressive scores, but, and this is an important thing that gets often overlooked, the 10-gram dose doubled the amount of creatine accumulation in the brain. So the thought here is that 10 grams doubled the amount compared to 2 or 4. The brain has the blood-brain barrier, so maybe a higher dose is needed compared to muscle, which essentially acts like a vacuum. The blood-brain barrier says, hey, we don't need you unless we're stressed. So I currently have changed my dosing protocol. I've been taking creatine for well over 2 straight decades. I used to take the traditional, 3 to 5 grams a day. I currently take at least 10 for the whole body benefits, primarily cognitive effects. And I'm an N of 1, but I've certainly noticed a benefit cognitively, especially, you fly into Europe, you're jet lagged, writing grants, very, very stressful times. But we think you need a higher dose to get in through the blood-brain barrier, accumulate, and then cause some beneficial effects.
So you're saying dosage, would it be 5 twice a day, or are you saying 10 at one bolus?
It's really up to you. Now, we are currently looking at dosing patterns in our lab, but the logical thing is that 10 grams once, 2 by 5s, twice a day, or if you want to take 15 grams, that would still accumulate over time. An exceptional study just came out last year, and I think you're probably well aware of it. It was in Germany, and they gave one massive mega dose, 0.35 grams to young individuals. So that was almost 30 grams, but they volunteered to be sleep deprived for 21 hours, and that massive dose did accumulate in the brain, and it also helped maintain cognition and memory after a night of sleep deprivation. So we used to think it took a long time to accumulate, but now we're starting to see maybe a higher dose can get in there. Can you take 30 grams a day for, months straight? I don't think so. I think that's very unfeasible for most people, but maybe taking a smaller dose and having a little bit more patience is there. So that's also changed the way we used to recommend, maybe just take creatine on the days you work out. Now we recommend every day so that some of that creatine can be trickling into all different tissues of your body.
Okay, from what I know from your work, 0.1 to 0.14 per kilogram of body weight is what you suggest.
Yeah, and that's a great relative dose. Yes, it is. Yeah.
So if someone's listening out there, you got anxiety, what do you recommend? Just from your anecdotal, because sometimes the research is not there, the science is not there yet. And so what would you say? Someone's they're anxious, they're 70 kgs, they're listening. How many grams, and do you divide it? What does your gut say there?
From anxiety specifically, there's not a lot of research, but in those individuals with clinical depression, and they also measured anxiety, the dose was higher. So it was almost 20 grams a day. The Candow study also looked at 10 grams in accumulation on depressive score. So it would be a lot higher, and it's up to the person. I think we don't know if you took small microdosing, like 2 grams a day times 10, or if you took a higher dose. I think the evidence or the studies need to be done there. But I think, logically 2x5s or a little bit higher could have some application from a dosing perspective.
Okay, so you're not going to separate anxiety, depression, or someone who comes in with brain fog or memory issues. There's no
Right.
difference there. You basically
Yeah.
saying the same dosage, and sort of
Yeah.
from a clinician perspective, it seems better that you would divide the doses. Wasn't there a study saying that you can't absorb more than 5 initially? This was a while back. There was
Yeah.
some
Yeah.
evidence saying you couldn't absorb more than 5
Yeah.
in terms of a bolus.
Yeah. That had to do with the peak in the blood and then the clearance. And we actually still don't know the optimal dose that will maintain absorption now because we have such an awareness on other tissues that will take it in. There's transporters in bone, the testes, obviously, cardiovascular system, and the brain. So I think taking 2x5 gram dosages, that would help maintain the peak plateau. The thought is if you took a 10-gram dose, it would definitely peak, but would you clear some through the kidneys because it might be too much? We don't know that, but I like your logic. I sort of do that. I take 5 grams in the morning and then I drink 5 grams in a water bottle during my workout. That's how I get my 10 grams. But if you wanted to take 10, it would probably not have a big noticeable effect. But we are starting to look at dosing studies shortly.
Tell me about the risks if someone takes too much of creatine.
Yeah, so the logical one would be if you're taking a high dose, two things. You're going to likely get some GI tract irritation if that does occur in you because creatine is osmotic. It will take water through the GI tract area. So some people report a little bit of diarrhea or GI tract stress when they're taking 20 grams a day for over 7 days. And then you can get acute water retention or weight gain. The other thing is that you likely would get an increase in creatinine. And most people listening say, oh, wow, I went to get my blood work and my doctor checked off that name. It looked like creatine, but it was actually creatinine. And of course, as you know, as a medical practitioner, most hospitals around the world simply look at creatinine as the filtration. And if that's high, it's an indirect indicator of poor kidney function. So please tell your doctor that you're taking creatine supplementation because it's likely that serum creatinine would go up. That's not a 100% indication that you have kidney issues, but please talk to your nephrologist or GP because likely what's happening is just the metabolism of creatine.
Okay, no change on sort of EGFR or cystatin C or anything like that from the kidney
Yeah,
perspective.
so that's a great point. So EGFR is the estimates. The statin C is way better. Doesn't take that into consideration. So typically what happens is people get false positives. It's just like going to get a PSA check. There's other things that can happen. And then they reduce or take away creatine. Creatinine comes down, EGFR goes back up to normal. And so then you know for sure it was just the metabolism of the supplement.
Okay, brilliant. Children
Yeah.
now, I mean, I'm seeing a
Yes.
plethora of
Yeah.
anxiety, ADHD, and it's just crazy. I've got a
Yeah.
21-year-old and I've got a 9-year-old
Yep.
because we went through a series of infertility. But I've just seen 80% of my daughter's class need some type of therapy, whether it's physical therapy,
Yes.
occupational therapy,
Yeah.
remedial therapy. And these kids, their central nervous systems are just absolutely wired, central
Yeah.
sensitization at another level.
Yeah.
What about creatine with children?
Yeah, so the limitation with our existing body of evidence in creatine in children is primarily based on subjective performance measures, so agility, balance, and some physical activity parameters. We're not seeing any side effects. We have not looked at blood or urine, but I would be very shocked if it has any side effects. Regarding the neck up, the only study that has looked at it in children was those individuals suffering head trauma. It sped up recovery, it decreased symptoms of headaches, improve self-care. And I can't remember if they measured anything around anxiety, but if it did improve symptoms of recovery, it could have application. But we'd be remiss to conclude it has any beneficial effects because there's no research there. But I'm sure that's an amazing focal point, especially for that psychiatry group out of Utah, to look at can this non-pharmacological intervention have applications
Mm.
for improving brain health, even in children. And I'm sure there's an area of that research coming out.
Do you know anyone that I could connect with from a physician perspective who would
Yeah.
have experience with creatine and sort of ADHD and any of these sort of conditions
Yeah.
to chat to? Because I think it's very important.
Yeah, Nick Fabiano, I'm starting to collaborate with in Ottawa. I can email you his contact there. He's a psychiatrist. And then the leading psychiatry group is Perry Renshaw and Brett Keos in Utah.
Mm.
So they have the MRS. So those are the two world leaders who have done the RCT. So I can email you those or
Okay.
email those names later. But Perry Renshaw and Brett Keos and Nick Fabiano in Canada, those are the three areas that are starting to look at specifically brain. Yeah.
I think it's fundamentally important. So I do
Yeah.
know that you did some work on caffeine and creatine. And
Yeah.
the reason I'm asking is just because
Yeah.
the effect of calcium. And I'm just
Yes.
thinking from a brain perspective. Now you're accumulating, you know, creatine in the brain. My sense is number one, you should have it after exercise or while you're
Hmm.
exercising. And
Yeah.
then secondly, having combined a lot of hyperbaric oxygen therapy, having it then and then doing hyperbaric or having hyperbaric and then doing creatine might sort of upscale or sort of advance the effects of it. What are your thoughts on just exercise, creatine, caffeine, and then the use of hyperbaric?
Yeah, so with exercise for sure, we've seen that it augments muscle contractions, increase creatine uptake into the cell. But when it gets to caffeine, it's a little bit interesting. Everybody loves caffeine, and most people are becoming more aware of creatine. And the only downfall is they do not oppose each other pharmacokinetically, but at the sarcoplasmic reticulum regarding calcium, caffeine likes to release calcium, and then creatine likes to take it in. So they play tug of war. The dose of caffeine seems to be implicated here. It seems that 250 milligrams of caffeine might hinder creatine over time. The nice thing is most black coffee or tea, small or medium or even a large, is under that. So that should not be an interference effect. But when we get into hyperbaric chambers, hypoxia comes to mind. That's where creatine seems to work because it's an anaerobic compound per se for performance. It essentially helps the mitochondria shuttle creatine into the cytosol. So one of the beneficial effects there is any hyperbaric or hypoxia. This is where creatine has been shown to have some beneficial effects. Yeah, absolutely.
So give me a bit of a short, quick protocol. Someone, because I've got a lot of athletes as well and
Yeah.
a lot of
Yeah.
executives that want to maximize and optimize their performance. What would they do with the creatine in a morning of exercise and hyperbaric?
Yeah, so they would take it at least an hour before, if not two. Takes about 1 to 2 hours to peak in the blood. And then the goal is that they'll go through the creatine transporter, get into the cell, and then it would be maintained for about 6 hours later. And then they would want to take another dose if they're willing to take more than 5 grams. But I think after the chamber, that would be a good way to replenish it, just like an exercise bout. So in this case, you could take the 5 grams and split it up, or if they're willing to go a little bit higher, that would be advantageous. Yeah.
Okay, other than because I have seen some people gain significant weight, and I've been
Yes.
taking it probably for about 10 years, and
Yeah.
I didn't notice a change with regards to
Yes.
water retention or anything on my DEXA scan. I sort of did my own sort of little research thing of
Yeah. Yeah.
taking a lot
Yeah.
of creatine, then doing a DEXA and that. But what's the percentage of people that'll say, listen, I've taken creatine, I've put on a lot of weight, I'm gaining a lot of this because it draws in fluid from what I
Yeah.
understand
Yeah. Yeah.
into
Yeah,
the
it's
muscle.
osmotic, so it will cause a fluid shift. So, for everybody listening, rest assured, after you do all the creatine intervention with exercise, at best we see a zero point 0.8 kilogram increase in body weight. But the nice thing is, the majority of that, if not more, is lean body mass, and about half of lean body mass is muscle. And what people probably will be surprised with is all the meta-analysis. There's two that have looked at adults 18 and above. Creatine and exercise reduces body fat. So that number on the scale might be a bit misleading. Please note is likely an increase in lean mass, i.e. water retention and muscle with training, and a decrease in fat mass. We typically only see these issues during the loading phase, and that lasts about 7 to 10 days. So if you're taking about 20 grams a day, so 10 times more than what we're naturally producing, this is where most people might put on about 1 to 3 kilograms of water retention during the first 10 days, but your body does adjust and subside over time. So it's very difficult to get young females to adhere to a resistance training and creatine protocol for that. Most times we do not recommend a loading phase at all. You do not need it. It's usually just for athletes or those needing to really saturate your muscle. I think a rehabilitation post-surgery where you need a really quick fix. If you're taking creatine for the health and exercise benefits, you could probably start as little as 3 grams a day. Take 3 grams a day, see how you feel. After a month, your muscles will be full. And then maybe you can increase it to hopefully say, hey, my muscles will be maintained. Now we can start to get into bone and brain. So I think for those just wanting to try it or interested, start with 3 grams a day for maybe even a month. And then if you're like, hey, I kind of like it, I've noticed a few more reps in the gym, I could run a bit longer, increase it up to 5 or 6, and then titrate your way up there. And that's a really safe, viable way to do that. Yeah.
Okay, good. Are there studies or any research or any anecdotal evidence on the improvement of VO2 max with creatine?
This is an interesting one. It's split. So there's some studies that show an improvement, and then others actually show a hindrance. And when you look at the mechanistic data, it looked like the weight gain that the individuals went into quickly decreased the amount of performance variables there. So when it comes to VO2 max, the research is essentially mixed. There's not a lot, likely because only in the last 5 years have we even considered creatine for aerobic-based individuals. It was primarily for weight training, and now it's exploded for agility, soccer, swimming, marathon, triathlon for recovery. But from a pure maximal oxygen carrying capacity, it's sort of split and it's mixed there. I think the logic is that maybe the individuals maybe put on weight and or were creatine as anaerobic. It may not have affected the training status till the very end. Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. Any pharmaceuticals that you got to be concerned about with taking creatine?
Yeah, nothing from a statin or ACE inhibitor. We're not seeing any effects of creatine on hypertension or cholesterol. If anything, it might have improvements. But obviously, anybody that's on any medication, please talk to your medical practitioner. Make sure the addition of creatine will not influence that. Again, creatine can acutely influence blood volume and pressure just because of the osmotic pull, but we're not seeing any no-nos with 100%. From statins to beta blockers to ACE inhibitors. I'm not aware of any interference, but again, I'm not a medical doctor. Make sure you talk to your medical practitioner if you're on any medication. Yeah.
Okay. Any studies with the use of TRT, testosterone replacement therapy, and creatine, and the
Yeah.
benefits, or if it makes no difference taking it with TRT?
Yeah, not yet. I mean, the only things we ever measure with testosterone is the new studies on hair loss, where they're looking at free and bound testosterone. But the logic is where creatine is, it has an anabolic profile, but it does not increase muscle protein synthesis like a whey protein would. But where testosterone is a lipid soluble, fat soluble hormone, which goes through the plasma membrane and directs DNA to make proteins. The thought is, could it complement it? Until we do the study, we don't know. The theory is there, but it would be a very interesting to say, can creatine, in addition to testosterone, especially for older males who require that from the anti-sarcopenic perspective, maybe now you're taking an anabolic hormone with a sort of a nitrogen-containing compound. That would be very interesting. Yeah.
In terms of absorption, you said GIT issues. I haven't had a lot of patients or clients,
Okay.
but what about absorption in the mouth if you had to put it directly sublingually?
Yeah, so we usually recommend to consume creatine through fluid because you're getting that extra osmotic pull. I know a lot of people will dry screw a scoop or take the candies or whichever it is. There's enough fluid through the GI tract that I think that's okay, but I have heard the most GI tract issues is when people dry scoop. There seems to be more cramping that way. So if that is causing it, maybe try to take it with a bit more fluid.
Okay. Any supplementation or antioxidants or anything like methylene blue, fisetin, any of these, quercetin that it really works well with or that it doesn't
Yeah.
work well with?
The only thing we ever see is that creatine and whey protein seems to have a synergistic effect. We're not seeing any combination with any of those high-powered or promoted antioxidants per se. There's been a few studies with sodium bicarbonate and beta-alanine for performance, but creatine does have anti-inflammatory and anti-catabolic properties itself. Could creatine in combination with NSAIDs be more effective for, post-marathon or something like that? We just need to see those data before we can make conclusions.
All right. In terms of my protocol, I don't know if you would add anything. I add glycine and salt, some really cool salt,
Yeah.
some Oryx desert salt with no microplastics, and then I add my creatine. But I'm having that before, while I'm training, and then afterwards. Anything else you would think would be beneficial to in terms of performance?
Yeah, from a performance, probably not. It depends, beta alanine or bicarbonate, if you're really going through acidosis. But the thought is maybe the magnesium could help with recovery a little bit. where you're already taking glycine, the magnesium might be there as well. Omega-3s, I always, that's one of my 5 staples because we've shown it has some potential anti-inflammatory effects there. I'm really interested in the whole NAD explosion. You know, we don't have any great research in humans. A paper just came out and said just because you have lower NAD, muscle function in older adults is not compromised. But the evidence in animals, which is obviously just potential, I'm curious to see where the NAD research goes later on. And then, of course, everybody's asking about collagen for arthritis and skin, but from a performance, you're likely hitting most there as well.
What are you
But
taking?
I
What
look
is
at
your 5 stack that you spoke about?
yeah,
You said, Amiga, tell us about it.
yeah. So that, number one, obviously creatine monohydrate. I love coffee, so caffeine is one of those there. Whey protein, and I usually mix that with yogurt or something like that. Omega-3 fatty acids, and then I also take vitamin D, magnesium, and a multivitamin. Just if I'm busy and traveling,
Mm.
that's just for more peace of mind. There's some that I've sort of toyed with a little bit. I'm being very aware or mind on the pulse of the NAD research. I want to see where that's going as I get a little bit older. But those 5 areas I think are really, really crucial for me at least, and I've seen some benefits. Yeah.
Mm. Have you, I mean, just done thousands of bloods now and people taking whey protein? I've
Yeah.
sort of looked at the Western price philosophy and it's sort of a little bit counter the meme out there, but I'm finding that whey proteins are increasing uric acid. Do you have anything
Okay.
to any studies or any sort of feedback on that? Because many of my,
Yeah.
male executives in the gym working hard,
Okay.
taking a whey protein every single day, and their uric acids, I mean, 80% of corporates that we've tested,
Yeah.
males, have high uric acid.
That's super interesting. You know, from a dehydration perspective, I'm not sure why the whey protein, it depends how much they're taking, of course, but like if they're taking 1 or 2 scoops a day, I don't know. Stu Phillips from McMaster University
Yeah.
is one of the world's best protein researchers. He would definitely be able to know and comment more on that, or Luc van Loon from the Netherlands. But I'm not sure why a whey protein specifically with uric acid. That's an interesting one, especially if you're
Mm.
seeing high promotion of that 80%. Yeah, I'm not sure. I can't comment on that, but Stu or Luc van Loon out in the Netherlands for sure. Yeah.
Maybe we can just get those details because we're seeing, I had David
Yeah.
Pilmata on the show. He wrote a book called Drop Acid. I don't know if you know David, but an
No.
incredible physician, neurologist,
Yeah.
and he just outlined all the details with high uric acid, what's happened in the last, since 1904, and
Okay.
just the increase and the cardiovascular risk that it has,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
cancer risk that it has, and the neurodegenerative risk that it has.
Yeah.
So we've been driving uric acid, especially in males, to, I don't know the numbers there, but zero point 0.3 at least, under 5, I think is the
Okay. Yeah.
US and the Canadian sort of metric. But it's becoming a significant problem.
Okay. That's super interesting. I'm wondering now about the processing, and it also goes, you trigger my thought process with creatine and homocysteine for cardiovascular and the methylation of creatine being produced in the body. The thought is it should decrease
Mm,
homocysteine, and half the studies don't show any effect. So it is interesting from maybe a processing perspective for how
mm,
our body metabolizes a synthetic supplement, but very interesting. But I'd recommend Stu or Luke Van Loon to come on the show. They'd be
mm.
phenomenal just to talk about protein in general for sure. Yeah.
Okay, so we've got a lot of metrics now. I've been using a sleep wearable for a long time, the original
Yeah.
Aura Ring plus Whoop now. We've used a whole
Yeah.
bunch of things. What's
Yeah.
creatine showing with regards to REM sleep? We've seen a big
Yeah.
change in REM sleep, I think, just because it's
Yeah.
sort of later in the sleep cycle. People are getting up earlier, they're under pressure.
Yeah.
I think it's causing a lot of problems with children. I think of my daughter
Yeah.
getting her up early, and then, in fact, I think there
Yeah.
were studies in Canada, the later the kids got up, the better their academic results were. I think there was a Canadian study showing. But what is happening with the science and the archetype of sleep and creatine?
Yeah. We only have minimal evidence on overall sleep, nothing on REM or non-REM. But we have shown last year in young females exercising that 5 grams of creatine for 6 to 8 weeks with weight training improved the amount of sleep on the days they worked out by about an hour.
Wow.
And then you piggyback that with now the benefits on memory and cognition during sleep deprivation. So there's something happening there. We don't know why. The theory is that maybe the brain is more recovered because creatine is coming to the rescue. Maybe the brain doesn't need as much recovery per se. It can maintain that during sleep deprivation. Why individuals would sleep longer, we're not really sure the mechanisms there as well. So this is the area I think needs to be a lot of mechanistic action. Because I've actually heard a lot of people say, geez, I take creatine and I'm up all night. I'm insomnia. I can't take it anymore. And I'm like, that's super interesting. And I recommended them to take it earlier on in the day, like, stop taking caffeine past 4 or 5 in the evening. Um, but I actually like taking creatine in the evening as well when I need it. And I haven't noticed any differences in sleep. So everybody's subjective, but we need a big RCT to look at all aspects of sleep, not only quantity, but duration, and then does that correlate into better functionality in the daytime? So all these metrics that we have now with Garmin watches, Whoop, things like that, the Oura Ring, we need a lot more of that. Or sleep labs. There's a lot of research labs in the world where people will go in there and they can look at a whole bunch of brain waves and EKGs and EEGs and things like that. So very interesting.
So someone who's battling with their sleep now, from a creatine perspective, should they take it half an hour before? Or when should they take it? Because if it does improve their sleep, then you would think
Yep.
you'd want to take it more closer to bedtime.
Yeah.
Secondly, what's it going to do to urinating at night? Because that becomes a
Point.
significant issue. So
Yeah.
maybe comment on those two
Yeah.
in terms of the best sleep protocol with creatine.
Yeah, I think for those who haven't had it before and started to take it, I would recommend taking it in the morning and then notice, hey, did your sleep better, after a week or two, maybe because this molecule is accumulating. And then secondly, if they're not noticing any improvements, you may want to take it a little bit later on in the day. The hydration or urination pattern comes to not so much the molecule, but we think it's the volume of fluid. And that's also another reason I recommend earlier on in the day. So they're not getting up all night and saying, oh, it must have been the creatine, when in fact it was the fluid they were drinking before bed or actually working out. Yeah.
Okay. So if they don't do a little bit of fluid and they want to say they don't notice a bit of sleep, they take it in the
Yep.
morning, Darren, then should they try and split it up and then take it just
Yes.
before bed, do you think?
Yeah. Or take it with supper time is another way to look, and then, hey, move on that way. And sort of be your own case study and see what works best for you. Yeah.
And there's nothing other than caffeine that they can sort of eat or consume that'll sort of inhibit the effect of creatine.
Not that we're aware of. Like, we definitely don't see any interference from magnesium or glycine or melatonin or anything like that. Creatine is pretty intact and robust. Caffeine seems to be the only molecule that there's some evidence that they interfere with each other.
Do you think, because there's some neurosurgeons and neurologists that saying creatine is not something that people should take. I haven't had them on the podcast. Could you surmise, and they haven't really on social media spoken about that, but is there a possible sort of theory out there or hypothesis that taking it over time can cause problems?
The only downfall is that if you do not require it, you could downregulate your natural synthesis, so it could alter some of your endogenous production. We don't see that in the liver, but there is evidence that obviously if you're taking creatine into the brain says, okay, if you're coming in, maybe I don't need to maintain the efficiency of the enzymes to create this two-step process. That's probably likely the only reason I can think of, because there's never been a single study to say anything got worse. If anything, it all got better. But my thought is they're probably thinking of your natural endogenous production, maybe where it can down-regulate the accumulation. Why they say don't rely on it. It's almost like a drug effect. That's probably the reason they might, but I can't speak for them. Yeah.
And from your experience, those that are not omnivores or carnivores, those that are vegans or vegetarians, have you just anecdotally seen a bigger benefit to that group?
Yeah, there's been probably about 10 to 15 peer-refereed studies now on vegans, and they respond exceptionally well from a muscle perspective and also a cognitive perspective. We don't really have good evidence on bone, but from a muscle perspective, muscle cross-sectional area, strength and performance have gone up substantially in vegans. And one of the first studies on cognition by Carolyn Ray showed that in vegans, they respond exceptionally well to creatine there as well. The interesting thing, though, is that unlike muscle, omnivores and vegans typically have the same amount of creatine in the brain, and we think it's the protective mechanism of the blood-brain barrier. And where the brain creates its own creatine, it's trapped there. Unfortunately for vegans, you only have about half the amount of creatine in your muscle, and that's why they respond so well to supplementation. The good news is all reputable creatine that you can find is vegan-based. So for the vegans watching or listening, they can consider it, but just make sure it's third-party tested. It has Create Pure or creatine monohydrate, and it's GRAS status. So the safety profile, you ought to make sure it's safe. And the other thing is make sure it's monohydrate. There's a lot of marketed forms out there, and when I say creatine today, I'm only referring to monohydrate for two reasons. It's safe and effective. All the other marketed forms, we just don't know the safety and efficacy profile.
Mm. Okay, so just a personal question. My daughter's 9 years old. I want to give her a creatine. Do you think I start
Yep.
with a gram, 2 grams a day in the morning? How do you think I sort of dose it? I mean, this is not medical
Yeah.
advice. This is just your
Yeah.
perspective.
Yeah, the dosing is usually around the 0.1 gram per kilogram, and
Okay.
obviously they're a lot lower. But I think if it was my child, I would start 2 to 3 grams a day and do that for 1 month, 30 days. And if she says, I don't really notice anything, then increase it up to five. And then five is a very viable dose at that size of an individual. And then you could slightly go up a little bit more as well as she grows and gets larger. And I think that's
Mm.
very viable as well. Yeah.
Okay, I mean, creatine, I think, is there anything else that you want to talk about with the creatine? Because I do want to talk about other things that you have found really beneficial for
Yeah.
mental performance or
Yeah.
athletic performance. But
Yeah.
anything else you
Yeah.
want to mention for creatine?
Yeah, the big one I think is the timing. Most people say, God, do I need to get this in at a certain time? And the good news is whenever it's convenient for you. You can
Mm.
take it when you wake up, before exercise, during, after. So it does need to accumulate. So unlike caffeine, you can actually take it at any time of the day. Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, so give us some things with regard to mental performance that you think like, are there things that you're working on from an exercise physiological perspective that are interesting now that can sort of help, creatine work, or you've just seen that
Yeah.
are really promising in your labs
Yeah.
or in your research?
Yeah, the interesting thing regarding mental fatigue or post mental fatigue and challenge maintaining memory and cognition, and good evidence is now starting to accumulate in the rodent model with BDNF, which is quite
Okay.
interesting. And my colleague Serge Osiak in Norway has shown that neurofilament decay, which is an end marker of neuronal damage, goes down with an increase in dietary creatine. So not supplementation, just having at least 1 gram of creatine in your diet is really important. We're starting to see that the minimal threshold for antidepressant and reproductive issues. So make sure those listening, you're getting about 1 gram of creatine in red meat or seafood. If the vegans are listening, then obviously you might have to rely or consider supplementation. But we're starting to see a little bit more mechanisms. Creatine has now been theorized to be a neurotransmitter. So maybe very acting with acetylcholine to get into the cell or activate it a bit more. So we're starting to see an emergence on the mechanisms. And I think that's going to help explain why people might have greater memory and cognition or neuroplasticity after head trauma. So this is a fascinating area. And I think as we move forward with conferences and podcasts like this and getting the medical community on board, I think it's something that will be a lot more people aware. Right now, we get about 35 million people are taking creatine, and I think it's projected that 350 million in 10 years will be based on evidence-based research. So we're hoping it can have some small improvements. It's not magic, it's not a cure, but at least it's something to consider to improve longevity and or functionality.
Sure. Sounds pretty amazing. So taking things like phosphatidylcholine or anything else
Mhm.
that would work synergistically, what else do you recommend? Or phosphatidylserine with it or what?
Yeah. All of those are right there. Taurine comes to mind,
Mm.
magnesium, all of these nootropics are so emerging. And we got to be a little cautious that unless it's backed by evidence-based research, if it's shown in a rodent model, it may not work in humans and vice versa. But there's a lot of hope there. But there's a few things that I'm very curious. I think magnesium is one that I would sort of pay attention to. NAD from the anti-aging potential down the road if it's been shown in humans, which it hasn't really yet. So there's a lot of hope. And I think, again, we've been doing this for decades, and I'm sure we'll be doing it for a few
Yeah.
more. And then we'll still say, I don't know, we got to keep going, right? So, yeah.
Okay. In terms of magnesium and with creatine, because it goes into the brain, do you think something like a magnesium threonate would be helpful? Do you know any
Yeah.
research, or are you studying magnesium threonate? Because it seems like you're quite interested in that.
Yeah, well, we're not specifically studying that, but a lot of colleagues are. They're looking at all forms of magnesium for sleep or recovery or performance.
Mm.
And I think that's an area that's really exploded. There's a lot of people now putting magnesium in their top five,
Mm.
supplements are top 10, and that's an area, but we're not doing anything specifically. We're very focused on creatine monohydrate currently.
Okay. I know you do a lot of teaching in that. Is there anything
Mhm.
like you teach your undergrads or your grads
Yep.
with regards to nutrition or creatine
Yeah.
that would set a foundation that you'd want people to know?
Yeah, I usually preface this in my sport nutrition class. Exercise is the cake, protein is the nice icing around, and the creatine is like the sprinkles that go on top to make it work a bit better. It has effects. It increases lean body mass, muscle mass, performance, functionality, and now we're talking about the benefits on the potentially the heart, bone, and brain, especially as we get older. So it's not magic. It's really needed in combination with exercise to really unlock the totality of evidence. But I do look at the evidence-based research from a teaching perspective.
Mm. And your dosage on protein, I'm on the higher side at
Yep,
1.5 grams per
yep,
kilogram body. I
yep.
don't know where you're sitting because I think it's from zero point 0.8. A lot of them are recommending zero
Yeah,
point 0.8 grams, which is quite low per kilogram of body weight. What is your
yeah,
recommendation?
yeah. We use the range 1.1 all the way up to 2.2 grams per kilogram or a gram per pound. And I likely try to get a gram per pound to be in the surplus for hormone synthesis, collagen, everything that's coming in as we get older. So 1.6 seems to be the medium. And of course, it's very tough to garner per day, but once you get into a consistent eating pattern. So
Mm.
I'm in the camp of the more protein, the better, as it currently stands. And if you have no existing kidney or liver issues, it should be fine.
Okay. All right. Last question. What are you really excited about with the future in terms of exercise physiology? I mean,
Yeah.
we in South Africa, we're looking at things like, the use of EWAT. It hasn't really come here, or,
Okay.
EBOO in terms of exercise physiology, getting more VO2 maxes. I mean, what
Yeah.
is really happening out there that you say, hang on, this is going to be a game changer?
Yeah, I think the regarding exercise physiology, my thought is, geez, we have so much awareness about the body. What about individualized nutrition programs based on the physiology of the body? So, for example, if you take a biopsy and you have more type 2A fibers, should your nutritional patterns really mimic that type of fiber? If you're born with 70% type 1, are you going to be taking in more fat and low glycemic carbohydrates? So, Wim de Rave out of Belgium has talked about individualized nutrition for future Olympics, World Cups, rugby championships, whatever it is. I think individualized nutrition in combination with exercise physiology, I think that's probably what's going to start happening in the future. If you take a rugby team, not everybody is born the same. I mean, their fiber type distribution is so out of whack and central nervous system. But the more data we have on that person, maybe we can manipulate their nutrition and or recovery principles to meet that. And that's why we'll probably see athletes run the 100 meters, in 7 seconds. We'll probably start to see the marathons run in less than an hour and a bit or whichever it is. It's probably coming with technology, but my guess is individualized nutrition meets exercise physiology or muscle physiology for optimal performance. I think that's where it's going.
And probably, just talking about creatine, there's going to probably be a very specific dosage and
Yeah.
timing of that dosage in terms of your
Yes.
lifestyle.
Yeah, like for example, you take out a muscle biopsy, and if you have 71% type 2A fibers, wow, you're going to need a lot more creatine because you're going to store it more compared to the person who has 31%. So 100% is not just nutrition. Now you're looking at supplementation protocols, and oh wow, you have a lot more fast twitch fibers, so you're going to be producing more hydrogen ions when you're exercising. So you need more bicarbonate and beta alanine compared to someone else. So I think it's a game changer coming down the line with technology, and very, very curious to see the Olympics in 20 years, how we've become so advanced. Yeah.
Okay. Last message of hope for people, in the 26 years of practice, this last 5 years has been tough since COVID. People are full
Yes.
of despair, there's anxiety, there's
Yep.
depression like never
Yeah.
before. Just a message of hope for people listening out there with regards to the future.
Yeah, I think moving forward, a couple key things. Make sure you exercise. That has to be foundational. We still can't describe the benefits of exercise, and nor do we want to. It's almost like a magic effect. Proper nutrition will help you make exercise be better. Try to reduce screen time and stressors in your life the best as possible. And really don't take for granted. I think COVID showed us things can be taken away from us when we didn't want to. And it's made a lot of people aware of and how precious life is. But I think from a key perspective, exercise and proper nutrition and adequate sleep and laughter, those are the key messages moving forward for sure. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, Prof. Darren Candow, I just want to declare favor and blessing over you. that you would
Yes, you
just live
too.
out your dreams, that your career would be just one of absolute fruitfulness. And we're here in South Africa. We've opened our home to many podcast guests that have come through. So please, at any stage, it's a bucket list place. Your dollar
Right.
will go very far here. I don't know if you've been. Have you been to South Africa at
I
all?
have, and I've always wanted, so maybe I will take you up on that for
Hit
sure.
me up. We've got an incredible network. We'll be able to send you to Cape Town and even
Yeah,
places like Zambia or Vic Falls
yeah,
is a must. So I've also learned from, just having so many patients struggle is we've got to live life, live these moments and
yeah,
celebrate them.
100%. Thank you so much for having me on.